Hello to everyone joining from around the world. My name is Sarah Greengrass, and I'm Executive Director of the U.S. Afghan Women's Council, a bipartisan public-private partnership that has, for 20 years, worked to advance and elevate Afghan women and girls. It's a pleasure to be introducing today's program, which we are hosting jointly with the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center. Before I begin, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the victims and those affected by the earthquake in Western Afghanistan earlier this week, further compounding an already dire humanitarian situation. A looming intersectional humanitarian and economic crisis threatens to throw Afghanistan further into turmoil. Afghan women have critical skills, knowledge, expertise, and insights that must be centered in order to address these and other formidable challenges facing Afghanistan. However, as a U.S. experts report released yesterday highlights, Taliban leaders in Afghanistan are institutionalizing large-scale and systematic gender-based discrimination and violence against women and girls. Such policies do not bode well for supporting women's irreplaceable contributions and involvement at all levels of society, politically, economically, socially, and otherwise. It's in this context that we're here today to discuss women's role in the future of Afghanistan. To do that, I'd like to briefly introduce our moderator and speaker of panels, and their bios are available on the Atlantic Council registration page for this event. Our moderator, Anita Mcbride, is executive in residence at the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies in the School of Public Affairs at American University in Washington, D.C. She previously served as assistant to President George W. Bush and Chief of Staff to First Lady Laura Bush from 2005 to 2009, directing the staff's work on a wide variety of the First Lady's domestic and global initiatives, including with primary responsibility for Mrs. Bush's extensive work in supporting Afghan women, including organizing her 3 visits to Afghanistan. She is a member of the U.S. Afghan Women's Council, the Advisory Council on International Republican Institute's Women's Democracy Network, and served 11 years on the Fulbright Board, overseeing and expanding the Afghan portfolio. Belkis Ahmadi has over 20 years experience working in Afghanistan on issues related to gender, human rights, civil society, development, rule of law, governance, and democracy. Her experience includes senior management positions on large USAID programs, including elevation, analysis, and design of gender and human rights programming. And she has worked closely with civil society and was a founding member of the Afghan Women's Network. She currently works for USIP as a senior program officer, overseeing the Institute's Afghanistan programs. Ambassador Shakira Barazkai, former ambassador of Afghanistan to Norway, is an Afghan politician, journalist, woman and human rights activist, and prominent Muslim feminist. She studied hydrometeorology and geophysics at Kabul University and has had over 20 years of experience in legislation and lawmaking, including for the Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Hosna Jalil previously served as Deputy Minister of Women's Affairs and Deputy Minister of Interior Affairs in Afghanistan. At the Ministry of Women's Affairs, she worked to transform the government's policies for women from a victim-centric approach to one of developing Afghan women. Her work for the Ministry of Interior Affairs was to support civilian policing, institutional development, diversification, and depoliticization of the Afghan police force, inclusion of women in the force, and promoting human rights values. And Muqaddis Yorish is a former Deputy Minister for Commerce and Industry who joined the Washington University community as the Elliott School for International Affairs new J.B. and Maurice Shapiro Professor of International Affairs this month. She has broad government experience, including service as a commissioner on Afghanistan's National Civil Service Reform Commission, and prior to that, as Human Resources Director of the Municipality of Kabul. She was country director for Lapis, a top strategic communication firm of Moby Group, giving her private sector experience as well. Finally, Rina Almari is currently the U.S. Special Envoy for Afghan Women, Girls, and Human Rights. Under the Obama administration, she served as a senior advisor to the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Ms. Amiri brings over 2 decades of political expertise, advising and working with governments in various conflict settings throughout the world. Her areas of focus are peace and security, with a specialization in inclusion and mediation processes. With that, I have the distinct pleasure of passing the microphone to Rina Almiri, U.S. Special Envoy for Afghan Women, Girls, and Human Rights at the Department of State, to make her opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you to the U.S. Afghan Women's Council and to the Atlantic Council for convening this very important discussion. And it's an honor for me to have my first public engagement with these 2 organizations that have a long history of prioritizing the voices of Afghans themselves, which I think is the most important factor in any discussion on Afghanistan. It's 20 years ago when the U.S. Afghan Women's Council started, when it came into place. I think it was actually 2002. There was a time of tremendous hope for the future and a sense of joyous celebration that the half of the population that had been silenced would now be in a position to utilize their own voices rather than the international community speaking on their behalf. Now we're coming at a much more somber place. From August 15th was, personally speaking, I think one of the most devastating days of my life. And I think everyone that worked on Afghanistan for the last 2 decades, not to mention Afghans themselves, that this was beyond any worst case scenario that any of us had envisioned or as a possibility, had foreseen as a possibility. And the question today is, where are we? Has all been lost? And what is the road ahead? And I think we have to step back and ask, in terms of the gains achieved, where was that stored? Was it stored in policies? Was it stored in institutions? Was it stored in people? And I would say it's all of the above. And we have to work at all fronts. But I want to note that what we have to build on is that there is a tremendous level of leadership among Afghans themselves that have to be leveraged, that have to be amplified, and that has to be given space. And in terms of the way I see my role as Special Envoy for Afghan women, I will not be speaking on behalf of Afghan women. I will be leveraging and amplifying their voices and creating space for them. That is the only way that I see my job as being effective, because the voices both inside Afghanistan as well as the recently exiled Afghans who represent the breadth of leadership on not just on women's issues, on the whole host of issues that we must now tackle in order to address the devastating situation inside Afghanistan. So foremost, I would say that we need to do what we're doing today is creating that space for Afghan leaders to speak on their own behalf and on behalf of the country. And hopefully we'll have more voices also from inside the country that will be part of these discussions. And certainly that is a key element of my strategy, is establishing consultative mechanisms, both identifying how to do this inside Afghanistan without putting those that participate at risk, and pushing for Afghans to participate in track 1.5, track 1, track 1.5, track 2 processes. Second, we have to hold the Taliban accountable. We have had now years of the Taliban putting out rhetoric that we have clung to as hopeful and have built policies and positions on the basis of hope. And it hasn't worked out so well, if I can put it mildly. Now we have to look at what they're actually doing. Now, for example, they've just noted that they're going to let girls back into school. What does that mean? We heard this the last time that the Taliban were in power, and they said that we have to segregate schools. We have to have security in place. This time, before any type of discussion is had in terms of an engagement of what the Taliban want, we have to see real delivery. And right now, what we're seeing is hardly a positive trajectory. Afghan women's and rights are being forfeited every day, and the population at large. I should note that my portfolio is women, girls, and human rights. That there are so many vulnerable communities in Afghanistan that are under tremendous threat, and every assessment that I've looked at shows that what is taking place in Afghanistan is turning out to be a very grim reality, even when we don't have the monitoring mechanisms in place to be able to make a full assessment. But it is a situation that is dire, and that the Taliban have to be held accountable for, including the humanitarian situation. The humanitarian situation is not, there's been a lot of focus on what the international community should do, but there should also be attention to the fact that the Taliban, by instituting the policies that they did, by taking militarily over Afghanistan, they set in place measures that they knew were going to unfold, that were going to harm the Afghan population. And so there has to be an accountability on their side as well. And what we have to do is look at every step of the way in terms of what they're delivering, hold them accountable, make sure that it's measurable. And on our end, we have to also be accountable. In terms of my office, when I took this position, I had two very extreme reactions. Those that expressed tremendous hope and noted that they had enormous expectations in terms of what my office would achieve. And those that said, it's going to be another office where there's going to be a lot of nice speeches. And it's not actually going to materialize into anything. The way that I want to respond to that is I am very cognizant of the enormous challenges that we face, both in terms of the stance of the Taliban, in terms of the waning leverage of the countries that supported the rights-based agenda. The fact that neighboring countries have not been as forthcoming in holding the Taliban to the standards of inclusion, particularly on women's rights and human rights. So bearing all of that in mind, I still I'm very committed and will be putting together a strategy that is based on extensive consultations with Afghan women and men themselves, where we identify what the parameters are, what the benchmarks should be, so that at the end of the year, that I can look back and say, this is what we came to a conclusion that may be achievable. This is where we made progress. These are the challenges that we faced, and this is the ways that we're going to try to do better. And I will make sure that that is a strategy that is laid out, and that is that not only do I consult with you in developing that strategy, but I report back, and that I continue to refine the efforts of my office through these ongoing engagements and through the standing consultative mechanisms that I'm going to be putting in place. In addition, I want to make sure that we mobilize the Muslim majority countries. What the Taliban are doing is not only damaging to the Afghan population, women and girls, but it's damaging to the image of Islam and to Muslim people. And I think that there's an importance in the Muslim world also holding the Taliban accountable. The Taliban do not have a monopoly on Sharia and on Islamic jurisprudence. We know that many countries, most Muslim countries, where women have a very prominent role in society, women are leaders. And those countries have to speak up and also have to speak for what is within the broad and very rich and diverse tradition of Islam, and how to have to counter the very regressive positions that the Taliban are espousing and projecting as Islamic values. And I want to make my comments brief because I do want to turn to the Afghan women leaders that are on the call who will guide us in this discussion. And I think will be key in terms of helping us identify what the path should be going forward. But I want to end perhaps on a hopeful note that even as, on the devastation of August 15th, institutions and governments failed or fell drastically short. But what was enormously encouraging to me is the fact that throughout the world, the citizens, the networks, the organizations that came together to support the Afghan people. Those are the networks that I'm going to be turning to as sort of the army behind us and forging a path forward. And then turning back to Afghan women leaders in particular themselves to identify how to calibrate those voices. No one should be speaking above the voices of Afghan women themselves, but how can that community help support and help leverage the voices of Afghan women and vulnerable communities that need to forge the path forward. So with that, I thank all of you, and I very much look forward to this being the beginning of a series of discussions on this important matter.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rina. We really appreciate you laying out what your vision is for your office and the challenge that is ahead of you and the robust consultative actions that you will take as you develop your strategy. And that starts right here today with this conversation with these very esteemed women and the network that we know you have. And we thank you for your 20 years or plus of engagement and support for human rights and for women's rights and for Afghan women. As you mentioned, the U.S. Afghan Women's Council is celebrating its 20th anniversary on January 28th of this year. And we are one of those strong networks that, of course, want to work with you. You're one of our members as well. So we will be there with you and support you as part of your army of support. What I also wanted to mention before we dive right into questions, because this is who, of course, we want to hear from today. And you alluded to this as well, Rina, about what are the measurements and the goals on the Taliban of how they can reconcile their approach to women, to wanting the international standing that they so desperately crave. And with that, I'd like to go right into questions with Belkis, if you don't mind, if I start with you, since you are very concerned, I know, about the plight of women's organizations under the Taliban restrictions, and particularly what is happening to professional women who have been building their country for the last 2 decades. So civil society and non-governmental organizations played such a strong role in the development prior to August 2021. What's your assessment of where these institutions are now and what we can do to protect and support them?
Thank you. Thank you, Anita. I would also like to thank the U.S. Afghan Women Council and the Atlantic Council for organizing today's event. Today, I will be speaking in my personal capacity, not as a member of the council or as a staff member of USAP. But before I answer the question, I would like to take a minute and remind all of us here and also the audience that just 30 minutes ago, Tamanna Zaria Pariani, a young Afghan woman, civil rights activist, a protester, was detained by the Taliban. This act must stop now. We are waking up every day. We're going to bed every evening hearing about such unlawful detentions of Afghan civil society advocates. I would like to take this opportunity and call on Ms. Amiri, her team, and the US government to mobilize resources and use its diplomatic leverage for the safe return of Tamannaah Zaghari. On the issue of civil society, I think before we talk about what does it mean now, let's talk about what civil society's role have been in Afghanistan, if that's okay with you, Anita. Between 2002 and the August of 2021, the bulk of humanitarian work, as well as institutional reform, public advocacy, delivery of public services, human rights and women's rights advocacy, and government accountability work, among many other work, were undertaken by national NGOs, civil society groups, and international organizations. Afghan civil society contained the biggest pool of quality human resources. Sadly, Taliban have viewed and treated civil society actors as their enemies, even prior to taking power in August. Civil society actors were targeted, detained, tortured, and murdered by Taliban. These abuses and violations have been committed with complete impunity. What was once a vibrant and active civil society in the region has now, in most parts, collapsed. Thousands of civil society actors have either fled the country to avoid persecution or are in hiding. But there are also others, such as Tamannaah, who has been putting her life at risk, speaking for justice, speaking for human rights and women's rights. For those who have been detained and tortured, their crime has been having served their people and for participating in the rebuilding of their country. It's worth mentioning that sadly, online attacks, bullying, and vilifying of civil society actors, particularly human rights and women's rights defenders, have worsened in the past couple of months. Now, on what can be done to protect and support civil society, particularly women's rights groups. First off, the international community must carefully calculate the consequences of their deals and compromising with the Taliban regime, a regime that continues to commit atrocities, violate human rights of Afghan men and women and children with full impunity, a regime that discriminates against women because of their gender, against minorities based on their ethnic and religious backgrounds, against their political opponents. And the list can go on and on. The UN and the whole of the international community must not turn a blind eye on the plight of Afghan people and civil society actors. Tolerating Taliban's behavior will have dire consequences, not only in Afghanistan or the region, but everywhere in the world where violent extremists are threats to democracy and global security. What can be done? Put pressure on Taliban. We have been saying that forever now. But not only on Taliban, on their supporters, including Pakistan, including Qatar, and other state and non-state actors. To provide and guarantee safe space for civil society and human rights and women's rights advocates. That's what's needed. And I think the international community should not turn a blind eye on those violations. Thank you.
Thank you, Belkis. Thank you very much. And actually, I'd like to pick up on, of course, a disturbing story that you just told me about the women's rights activist who was detained. And just yesterday, Human Rights Watch has published a report about the harsh tactics that are being used to crush Afghan women's protests, of course, in the street. At the same time that we're hearing reports that the Afghan acting prime minister is calling for official recognition of the Taliban administration, and in fact, putting even more pressure on Islamic countries to support them. And Ambassador Shakira, I'd like to ask you for this next question to follow on to that. For those women and for people who are not able to take to the streets, how can they show their resistance and how can they still help Afghanistan build their futures under this duress course that they are facing?
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, everyone. I salute your effort. In the last 20 years, each of you as an organization or as individual members, you try your best to support and to promote the women of Afghanistan, which is we've been under first Taliban. From my points of view, no matter if women are going on the street as a protester, they are putting their life in danger and risk, or if they are sitting at home, teaching other girls and delivering positive energy around people, which is they've been surrounded. They have a hope and they have a voices. Their voices is not means that they are not active. If you see, despite of all the protesters, there's a social media and communication. Usually it's going, I believe, not only with me, but with the large number of other women, which is we are physically not at the moment in Afghanistan. No matter what, there's their voices. But this is the matter with exactly their needs and demand. It's justice, rights, freedom, work, and of course, in such a humanitarian crisis, they are also asking for humanitarian aid. Plus, those whom they are their life in danger, they are asking for evacuation. I do believe they play a very significant role in Afghanistan, not only building up democracy, but they are the one they are maintaining democracy in today Afghanistan. Despite of all the challenges we had in the last 20 years, I think the only vibrant success, which is can shrink and can be loud, is the freedom of expression and the women's of Afghanistan. Not only they were not being a piece of show or a decorative piece for international conferences, which has been used time to time, but right now we can say the real success is on the streets, and the real success is those voices, which is they are loud enough. And they're asking for, of course, legitimate government. They're asking and they're contributing today, not only with the economic situation in Afghanistan, but they're also contributing with the machine of education to be move on. They're also contributing with the health sector. They're also delivering globally the right message to the people. Well, let me take you something. Let me take you all 20 years, 25 years back. The Taliban never was a great friend of Afghan women. Right now, they are bringing excuses. But what about 25 years back, where there was no challenges as today was? They stopped and they shut down the schools and universities for girls. And of course, they didn't let women to go and work. Taliban always been against progress, against education, against prosperity in a country, against freedom of expression, against democratic values, against human rights and women's rights. So this is like not something new, which is, I should say, Taliban are reacting. No, this is the old Taliban with the old mentality, but this time more aggressive. The way they are punishing, the way they are doing, as rightly Rina says, it's not any Islamic values. Whatever they are doing, it's against the Afghan culture, it's against also the Islamic values. But let me tell you one thing, what needs to be done collectively. Those women, which is they are sitting at home and they've been forced to do not go out of their houses. Even today, as you know, there is also some certain measures on their movements. Even a taxi driver can stop women from taking her from one direction to another or from A to B. So this is the situation of Afghan women. It's not only Taliban, even a taxi driver can be a decision maker for us. So our outfit, our dresses, or even the public bath, which was been very famous, Taliban shut down that one also for women. So it's a very pity if none of organization or we women as an individual should not be their voices. So if they can go to the street and make a sentence, we are here to write a chapter about it. We are here to make those voices to be more louder. And I think this is the right time that we should submit a case against the policy of Taliban, against this systematic discrimination based on gender violence, which is going on at the moment in Afghanistan, to ICC, International Criminal Court. We have to hold Taliban accountable, yes. Meanwhile, we should ask for justice. We should seek for justice in the international level. So those women, which is they are sitting at home, they contributed a lot with the Afghan economy. And right now, this is the time that we should reach to their houses. We should bring them out back. If the government of the Taliban are not ready to hire women, what about the international organization? What about the local organization? What about the NGOs? We need to bring back women in the society through to the NGOs, through to the distribution, the humanitarian aid. At least that is maybe one of the positive things, which is if the international organization, United Nations, can lead that, I think that will bring some kind of changes. But to be honest, the intimidation of the Taliban from the women, the fear they have, the threat they feel, it's been a historical issue. They never let the women of Afghanistan to breathe freely, to work and to raise their voice safely, and to be vibrantly and physically in a society. This is what is my expression and understanding from the Taliban. But nevertheless, the women of Afghanistan, despite of where they are, the office or the house, as a prisoner or as a someone with a full civil rights, they have their voices, and we are here to serve them. And that's why after 20 years, when the government collapsed, when the international community left, when we've been betrayed badly, the only great voices and achievement, which is today every one of us can head up and be proud about it, is the investment of 20 years, the new generation of Afghanistan, which has been well skilled. And of course, the voices on the streets, which is time to time, it's shaking the world and reminding everyone, hey, we are here. We are asking you to help us. We want democracy. We want justice. We want freedom, just the basic rights for education, for work.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you very much. And actually, your presentation or your answer leads me to the question that I wanted to ask Mukaddes, because having served as Deputy Minister for Commerce and Industry, and also her experience in the Civil Service Commission, helping to build the capacity of women in the workforce, I am interested to hear from you, Mukaddes, about Afghan women who did enter the Afghan workforce. They entered in growing numbers. They started their own businesses. They were making up the ranks of the civil service, both areas that you oversaw. What advice would you have, or is there that we can share with women to maintain some access to income, during this real critical time? And are there arguments that would even work with the Taliban, as the ambassador said, who has not respected the role of women ever? But are there any arguments that could be used with them that allow some broader interpretations about women's role in the economy and in business?
Thank you, Anita. I also would like to say my greetings to everyone here. present in the audience, and especially the organizers who have put together this important panel today here. Anita, that's a lot of questions to try to answer, but let me start from here. I have a question for everybody here, both in the audience and the organizers of the panel. Because given my experience of how things unfolded in Afghanistan in the past 3 or 4 years, especially since we started having these conversations of peace with the Taliban, I'm not entirely sure if our international partners really believe in their own investment in the Afghan woman. I think that is something that we all need to first sit with ourselves about it and really try to break it down for ourselves. Because if anything, the women of Afghanistan in the past 3 or 4 years felt really betrayed. Unfortunately, we were labeled things from urban woman to elite woman. The very urban woman or elite woman that the international community worked really hard in the past 20 years to partner with, to help them be the woman that they are today, where unfortunately their voices were delegitimized. And that includes my voice and voice of many of my other colleagues who were present in this call. And that is very disheartening. It almost makes me resentful to be present in another one of these conversations that talks about Afghan women and their progress in the past 20 years, when the progress is not given the credit that it is it is due. It is entirely right that our international partners provided the space for us, they helped us, but nobody walked that path for us. We had to walk it by ourselves. Each one of us here in this call, Deputy Minister Hosna, Ambassador Shakira, and each one of us who were actively trying to create progress back home. To just be a woman in that country, wake up every morning and try to continue to do what we were doing was a challenge in itself, let alone the type of threats that we were receiving as being part of the government, the challenges that we had in navigating the politics of the bureaucracy and the public space. So I think it's a little unfair for the progress of the woman was unfortunately brought down to labels and was entirely delegitimized. And what you're seeing today that's happening in Afghanistan is because that's exactly the argument that the Taliban have. If anything, this new chapter of resistance in Afghanistan, the one that's happening by the civil society and by women who are who are going out to the streets and at the risk of their lives, just like the case that Bilqis mentioned earlier in the call, Tamanna. If anything, it just speaks to the nature of these protests and also to what the social transformation that has happened in the past 20 years in Afghanistan. So I think it's really time for all of us to really give the women of Afghanistan the credit that they deserve. And then hopefully from there, we can try to move on into understanding that how we could possibly try to help women in this next chapter. I think that is something that I have been wanting to say for a long time. That is something that I have recently been saying. And that is also something that I wanted to bring up in this call. And going back, to my experience of working in the Civil Service Commission, I think every single woman who the Civil Service Commission, all we did was we were creating policies that made sure that women could be part of the workforce. But each one of those Afghan women who made the decision to come forward and be part of the workforce, I don't think they did it thinking that this was some act of kindness that they were doing to the project of women's right in Afghanistan. I don't really think that we really back home, that's how women think, that every single step that we take is actually our contribution to the global project of helping Afghan women. That is not true. And I really would appreciate that if our international friends going forward in their endeavors to help Afghan women to change their mindset about their own support. Unless and until you see you recognize Afghan women as agents in their own rights, and invest in their agency, I guess it's almost difficult for me to try to come here and say anything, to give solutions, when inside myself I am not sure if our international friends really believe in the cause of Afghan women. And when I'm saying they believe, they might believe in that, but the lens needs to change. Afghan women will do it anyways. They have been, if the resistance that's happening all over Afghanistan, led by women, they are calling for human rights. They are calling for civil rights. They are calling for rights of everyone to be respected. It actually has nothing to do with women. The fact that they are by gender women, that's a different thing. So, if and that needs to be acknowledged in its entirety. And when I say that, I think hopefully when we acknowledge that, I also would like Afghan women to be seen as political actors. I think it's time for the next chapter, and I don't really know, what sort of a time frame we are talking about, or what type of what the nature of engagement would look like again. But I think it's time that we see Afghan women as political actors. Because unless and until you do that, unfortunately, the Taliban are just seeing women as a project of the West, which is not a helpful lens for us. And given what I earlier said, that we Afghan women really don't see ourselves like that, So I think and seeing Afghan women as political actor, it's not only because of the framing of it, but I think if women deserve it, a woman like Ambassador Shakira, they're equally a political actor for me as much as their male counterparts. So I think just zooming out the issue of women rights and women progress into a bigger political agenda, I think might be the future and the way to move forward. Because as long as we keep it under the umbrella of humanitarian rights and women rights, I think that's how the Taliban, that's exactly feeding into what the Taliban want. And I think I will end it there, and I will be open to questions, and hopefully that in a way responded. But again, I told you, I don't really see myself in a position to talk about solutions. If anything, I would like to direct everybody to the protesters on the street of Afghanistan right now to ask for solutions. All I can do is I can, at least try to tell everybody that it's time for all of us to change our framing, to change our lenses, and see women of Afghanistan for who they are. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I think you have, elevated a point that is really important. And I know something, of course, that Rina and her office will be focused on too. All of you are political actors for your country. And as you mentioned, the ambassador, who also served as a member of parliament and wrote the laws and the rules and helped to write the Constitution of Afghanistan. I hear you, and I think all of us on this call hear you on how you want Afghan women to be viewed. And I think one of the striking areas of progress that women did make also in their country was how they entered the security forces. And I have to think, all of us have to think how they are feeling now to see women being really harmed and beaten on the streets as they're trying to secure their rights. And that is the question I wanted to ask you, Husna, because I know you were of course, as a deputy minister, not only of women's affairs, and of course, you grieve that that ministry has been closed, but also you're the deputy minister of interior affairs, and you help to integrate Afghan security forces in the police force with women. So I wonder if you could talk about that. Are there any practices or lessons learned from integrating women into that sector of a society that could be applied now as we look to this idea of women as political actors in their country?
Thank you so much, Anita. It's such a pleasure and honor indeed to speak together with the distinguished panelists. And thank you to Atlantic Council and the U.S. Afghan Women's Council for providing the opportunity. Before jumping on the inclusion of women or the effectiveness of women's presence in the security and defense forces, I can also represent the defense forces as well.
Right.
I would like to echo what Muqaddasa rightly mentioned, that women have been equally effective, even if not more, as political actors, but I may add here something, that they have been the most constructive political actors in Afghanistan, not the destructive ones. We have seen, I think, all the male and female actors in Afghanistan, but what I with confidence can state is that those who have been enabling us to have the progress that we claim right now, although we have had hundreds of steps back, but what we achieved in 2021 before the collapse, it has been because of the few constructive political actors, female political actors, that can be from lawmakers to ministers to deputy ministers around the cabinet, or to the civil society, to the media actors in the media industry, and to so many women who believed in peace. They have been maybe on the other side, but they really believed in peace. And I can also see, can feel actually the pain in the voices of all the panelists, which makes me feel bad. So going to the women's inclusion and their effectiveness, actually, how effective they have been in the security and defense sector in the forces. In terms of the percentage, we didn't have much, or I can say it has been satisfactory. We had only 3.5% in the police forces, and we had less than 2% in the army, women. But in total, they made up more than 6,000 women in the armed forces and the law enforcement forces. My experience working with them for more than 2 years in the Ministry of in the Ministry of Interior Affairs, directly with the women in police, in uniformed, and the civilian ones working for the Ministry of Interior Affairs, and indirectly with the women in the army. They have been serving Afghanistan from the combat forces, countering terrorism, countering narcotics, to the law enforcement activities. To be very honest, I'm amazed with their courage, dedication, that I would say our male didn't bring maybe 50% of that. And their their ambition for progress, it wasn't an individual self-interest-centric ambition, I would say. They really, each and every single one of them really wanted to pave the way for other women to come. Each and every single one of them have been a campaign agent for us to bring more women and to convince them in a very conservative society of Afghanistan. The armed and the security and defense sector in Afghanistan should have been the last, I would say, sector that an Afghan man could ever let their wives, their daughters, their sisters, even their neighbors to go to that sector. A couple of areas that I'm so proud of the women to leave a legacy in those areas in the defense and security sector. The male colleagues in a combat forces could tell me how brave their female colleagues are, because they're fighting at so many different fronts, dividing their attention in an operation that could be from civilian evacuation to fighting the enemy in the front line. That's something that, I'm quoting their male colleagues from an operation. That's something that men could hardly do it. Dividing their focus inside a building, which is hijacked by terrorists, into both saving lives at the same time, saving their own lives and killing the enemy, a terrorist, literally. I think that's the skill set that a woman brought into the forces that was appreciated by their male counterparts too. The women have been the frontline fighters to corruption inside the institution, if we look at the institutional perspective. The areas where we included more women have been the more highly vulnerable departments to corruption, including the public services, where we had a very high rate of bribery. And I mean, based on the experience, I can say that in 6 months, we had the least complaints from the Ministry of Interior, had a lot of complaints. I mean, the public have been highly unsatisfied with. But the areas where we had women in the front line in terms of dealing with the public and decrease the vulnerabilities to corruption, they have been highly effective. In just 6 months, the areas where we had the highest rate of people's unsatisfaction, that has been dropped. So I would say they have been from an institutional perspective, they have been very effective in terms of countering corruption or decreasing institutional vulnerability to corruption. I think they've been fighting not for salary, not because 62% of the women in the armed forces have been breadwinners for their family. Yes, that is a data. But working with them and looking at the morale, no, they haven't been working in the security sector to finance or to support their families only. They have been choosing serving in the armed forces among other options they had. It wasn't the only option for them to work, actually. But if they, as a young mom, having 3-year-old kid, leaving her kid in Kabul and joining an operation in Lugar, that's merely a career choice.
Husna, thank you. We obviously, all of us feel the depth of pain that each of you has expressed today. And we have been challenged to think about how the international community feels about its investment to help Afghans and to help Afghan women. I thank you for being so brutally honest with us. We do have some questions that have come in. We have not a lot of time to get to them, but there is one that I would like to put out to the group. And I think Mogadisa, you have expressed an interest to answer this one about the difference of being able to the rural and urban divide in Afghanistan for Afghan women. Would you please address that?
Yes, thank you, Anita. That's actually one of my favorite questions, and I can't wait, to respond to Kamal, because and I understand it's a very, it's pretty much raised by everyone. But let me tell you something. I want every Afghan woman to have their individual conception of freedom, regardless of where they're located geographically. To have the right to movement, I don't think any rural Afghan woman wants to be sitting in their home all time and not being allowed to even go to a family gathering without a male chaperone, if we bring it in a rural context, So this whole juxtaposition of juxtaposing women against each other and polarizing, I think, is not helpful. If anything, it exactly echoes what I said earlier, that we need to acknowledge the agency of the Afghan woman. And even if for a minute, let's assume that this divide is true and that rural women want, are we implying that rural women should be left the way they are without access to their basic rights? If we're putting too much focus on the fact that most of what the women are demanding is urban and elitist. And also, let me tell you something. people like me, like Hosna, for that matter, Ambassador Shukriya, we all come from those rural backgrounds. We got education. We took the opportunities that were made available to us by mainly our parents, but also the international community, to become the urban elite that we are today. So should we be punished for that? Or should actually people respect the fact that we have a voice now, the work that what everybody wanted us to have? But the moment we have it, everybody just hurries to try to delegitimize that voice. I think this whole mentality, we need to sit down with ourselves. That's one thing. Second thing, I also have to tell you that at one point in Afghanistan, while I was watching this, how this polarizing narratives of urban and rural Afghanistan was being pumped into the peace process, I couldn't help but think that this was actually some of our international partners, mainly US, projecting their own divide on a country that couldn't afford it. You can afford these type of polarized conversations in democracies like the US, because you have the systems, you have the infrastructure to absorb these type of conversations. But for a country like Afghanistan, we couldn't afford it. It was being projected on us. We couldn't afford it. And that's exactly why the system collapsed and we are where we are today. So I really appreciate if our think tank people, our consultants, and everybody who is in this business of policy making, that before putting something as dangerous as these polarizing narratives out there, they just take a moment with themselves to try to understand how this is going to impact the life of people. Because if anything, what's happening in Afghanistan today does have to do with how narratives were framed around the social transformation and progress of Afghanistan that was so indigenous, to make it something imported, and is where we are today. I don't have anything else to say beyond this. Thank you, Anita.
Thank you, Mogadesa. And here we are now at 2:00 in the afternoon. Our program is coming to an end, and unfortunately, we could go on for another full hour with the questions that are coming in and for what all of our panelists have offered. I put this challenge out to the U.S. Afghan Women's Council and the Atlantic Council to do this again, and to do it as often as we need to do, to be the voice, to help be the voice for Afghan women who are doing all the hard work and have always done all the hard work themselves. So with that, I want to thank all of the panelists that are here. Harris, I'm happy to pass this to you to close, but this has been an extraordinary conversation. Thank you, the Atlantic Council. Thank you, the Afghan Women's Council, and our wonderful panelists.
Sure. Thank you very much. My name is Haris Samad, and I'm Assistant Director here at the South Asia Center of the Atlantic Council. As we close out this event, I also just want to start by thanking our esteemed panelists for joining us today and directing our thinking on these issues as Afghanistan moves through this critical time. I also want to thank the U.S. Afghan Women's Council, and in particular, Sarah Greengrass and Kate Reeves, for their partnership and for being wonderful collaborators, both on this program as well as the previous event series that we did last year. And to the audience, we invite you to visit the Atlantic Council website to watch those programs. In closing, I want to thank our viewers for joining us today and reiterate our gratitude to this incredible panel for once again reminding us that the future is indeed female. So with that, we are adjourned.